In the Oval Office meltdown, Trump alleged that Ukraine was losing the war. But is the reality on the battlefield telling a different story? Is Ukraine actually pushing back harder than they have in the last year? Plus, we're going to talk about the fallout from the meeting as U.S. politicians flip-flop so fast, it almost makes you dizzy. And, of course, the story that, frankly, I could tell any day of the week, which is Elon Musk having a half-assed take, this time saying that the U.S. doesn't need NATO at all. But is the reality a lot different? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this, I think, is the top stories, to me at least, is that we've seen a continued pattern of Ukraine pushing Russian forces back. Now, you could see the latest here near Lysychansk, right, where you're, in the kind of northern front near Kupiansk, where you're seeing Russian forces, again, get driven back, not in tremendous size, but this is actually one of the larger counteroffensives we've seen, driving Russian forces back almost 3 kilometers. That's actually pretty considerable, given the fact that we've not really seen these kind of sustained offensives that happen day after day after day in kind of the Russian style. And the fact that it involved driving Russians across this river here, which, given the current temperatures, it seems like there's probably a good chance these are actually flowing rivers. It's a sign, I think, that the Ukrainians are looking increasingly bold and ambitious in their willingness to stage these counterattacks. Now, I don't think this is going to be part of a larger offensive breakthrough. That's just not a thing that happens in this war, given the level of drone observation and the other tactics that have evolved. But neither Russia nor Ukraine seems to operate that way. But I think the big takeaway is that we're seeing more and more Ukraine say, listen, I think we can, in a sustainable way, take the fight to the Russians. We're also seeing in the Battle of Toretsk, right, where you've got easily some of Ukraine's best units engaged, what for a time felt like a one-sided defensive effort. In fact, this was the strategy when I was there in November. The guys from the Liut Brigade told me, they said, listen, our goal is to turn Toretsk into a killing cauldron, make Russian forces just pay as much as possible and grind them into the dirt in the city. But you can see that the grind has really taken a toll on Russian forces as we're seeing more and more Ukrainians push and potentially even cut off Russian forces inside the city. This would be the ability to encircle Russian forces would be a huge victory for the Ukrainians. And again, we haven't seen Ukrainian forces emerge victorious in kind of a larger urban combat. So the fact that this is even on the table, I think, is a sign of a really significant shift. It says that Ukraine has invested a lot in improving their offensive tactics. They've gotten combined arms, drone operations integrated very seamlessly into their units, not just airborne drones, but also ground-based drones as well. And I think you're seeing this start to pay dividends. I think the other thing is that we've talked about the fact that Putin is unwilling to stage a major mobilization drive, and I think recruitment is likely down even further than he is willing to publicly admit. I mean, he's never been public about any of their recruitment numbers, but the fact is that bonuses have continued to tick up at a rate that exceeds even the high Russian inflation, which indicates that they are struggling to get in the number of bodies necessary to conduct these operations. And once you see that kind of exhausted Russian forces, you are more likely to, this is exactly what you would see if Russian forces were indeed reaching exhaustion. In high attrition zones, you would see Russian forces start to sputter and spurt in terms of their ability to move the battlefield forward. Doesn't mean that they're not giving as well as getting in other places, right? Notably, again, in the Kursk counteroffensive, right? We've seen actually some reductions in the total controlled area, but these are sometimes kind of contested. And you can see that Ukrainian forces, again, trying to really establish a defensive line along this river, something that we've seen in the past has been an effective tool, particularly given how hard any kind of water crossing is. It seems highly likely that Ukraine is really adopting a terrain focus and holding Kursk. So I think this is a sign, again, that while it looks more and more like an even battlefield, instead of one where Ukraine's focus is on attriting Russian forces. Now, before we talk about the political fallout of not just the Oval Office blowup, I wanted to mention a couple of things. The first is that if you're interested in supporting Ukrainian units, I'm going to link below to a fundraiser for the Ukrainian Marines and their version of the Navy SEALs. Those guys are fighting in Kursk and Pokrovsk and can really use your help. But of course, if you want to support this channel and more importantly, get the premier energy gum, right? Amazon's highest rated energy gum. You want Strike Gum. It's made in the USA. It's veteran owned, right? And most importantly, it is the best way to get caffeine, period. In fact, it is combat tested. We sent it to a bunch of units in Ukraine. The feedback has been thumbs up, especially from drone pilots, right? As you can imagine, being an FPV pilot or a reconnaissance drone pilot, it involves a lot of sitting and staring, and you can't always look away to sip a big, heavy Monster energy drink. And so being able to just pop the gum in, chew it, and get your energy, you can't beat it. But you don't have to be a high-octane drone pilot to get the benefits, right? It's got 0 sugar, just 10 calories, 90 milligrams of caffeine, right? We're here and we're on Amazon. The link is in the description. Pick some up. And of course, if you like it, do leave a review on Amazon. That makes a big difference for us, right? So Lavrov. Now, one of the things we talked about with this Oval Office blowup is that for Russia, right, when they see their opposite negotiating party starting to fracture, right, it's a little bit like if you're trying to negotiate for a new car. The car dealer sitting opposite you, if you and your spouse start fighting, really going at it, that car dealer is going to go, great, well, I'm going to side with the person who says they want to spend more money. I'm going to exploit this contentious environment to my advantage. And that's exactly what we've seen. We've watched as instead of Russia coming closer and closer to an agreeable ceasefire, right? What we've seen instead is a hardening and a more extreme position. And you can see the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, is now using some language describing Zelensky as, quote, a pure Nazi and a traitor to the Jewish people, which is, again, a old talking point from the Russian Federation, alleging that, in fact, the Ukrainian government is actually a bunch of neo-Nazis. And this is part of a larger narrative that really is meant to sort of motivate the Russian citizenry. That's really what this is about. It's meant to evoke the World War II mentality, since, of course, Russia has taken more casualties in this war than it has since World War II. It's essential, actually, that Moscow recontextualize it as a World War II scale ideological conflict. You may think that this is absolutely insane, but this is what you would expect from a negotiator who believes their position is stronger than it's ever been. And this is sort of the problem, is that Russia has never been less successful on the battlefield this year, and yet they are now being more successful in the political realm because the number one hegemon that has been backing Ukraine now very publicly is like, we don't want to back them. We don't want to do this. And the absolute insanity of this is just, I mean, it's obviously a lie. I don't know what else to tell you. If you think that Zelensky is actually a Nazi, I don't know what to tell you. These are guys who, I mean, like, I don't know what to tell you. The Israelis would definitely say something if the U.S. was backing a neo-Nazi state. So, in fact, again, if you look at the ideology, one in which there is a preferred ethnic group and that the subordinate ethnic groups are naturally subordinate, that sounds a lot like Russia's official state ideology that holds that the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian state, is an artifice and that there is no true Ukrainian people and they're naturally subordinate to Russia. I literally the absurdity of the entire philosophical ideal is just ridiculous, right? But Kremlin at the same time is saying, hey, we are so glad that the U.S. foreign policy now is going to let us do whatever we want, right? In fact, they're saying it aligns with the Kremlin is saying that the U.S.'s foreign policy shift now aligns with its vision. And we've talked yesterday about what exactly the Kremlin's vision is. And the Kremlin's vision is explicitly, not implied, not sort of vaguely, but explicitly to destroy the United States as a world power and to create a United States that only gives a shit about itself and leaves the rest of the world for Russia to coerce, influence, and overthrow. Right? Now, they said, again, the Kremlin spokesman said exactly, the new administration is rapidly changing all foreign policy configurations. This largely coincides with our vision, right? And what I think is interesting is that, again, Russia has shown repeatedly that it is an unreliable partner, right? And that there is no collaboration to be made with Russia, or when there is, it is based entirely on extreme levels of coercion, right? And look no further than, again, the Minsk Accords that Russia violated almost immediately that were negotiated primarily by Europe, France, and Germany. Look no further than the original agreement where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for a promise of sovereignty, a promise that lasted approximately 14 years before Russia annexed Crimea and Donbas, right? Look at how many other agreements with Russia have been made that Russia has simply put in the paper shredder. So this idea that there is some kind of long-term sustained cooperation with Russia is completely preposterous, right? And it is incompatible, again, with Russia's own stated vision of destroying the entire Western world and putting it under what they call Eurasian domination. Now, I also, that one of the creatures on this earth that I loathe at a level that almost is unprecedented is U.S. politicians. U.S. politicians, almost to a person, are some of the biggest scumbags on God's earth. They truly are just monsters sort of stitched together in the shape of people. And career politician Lindsay Graham is really taking the cake. Now, I want to observe as the ghoul actually changes shape before our eyes. Watch what he says on February 14th, and then watch as Lindsey Graham changes 180 degrees literally 14 days later, guys. This is the only time you have this change in cognition is when you have a stroke or a car accident. All right? Just join me in watching this in real time.
I want to tell you and your people, you're the ally I've been hoping for all my life. Not one American has died defending Ukraine.
Okay, that's not true. Lindsey Graham just says shit. There have been dozens of Americans who've died fighting for Ukraine. They volunteered for the Ukrainian, largely Foreign Legion or other sort of foreign entities or foreign groups within Ukrainian units. And they are heroes, but I understand his point. His point is no uniformed American service member has died fighting.
Taken our weapons and you've kicked their ass.
Yes. This is the core thesis here. When people say we haven't gotten anything from Ukraine, no, we have taken a country whose aspiration is to destroy us, and we have crippled and killed off huge portions of their military. Now, worth noting is that the Russian military may be stronger now than it was at the beginning because it was forced to evolve technologically. We may have accidentally created sort of the antibiotic resistant version of Russia's military because we underdosed all of the medicine, right? Instead of giving them all the weapons they needed to kick Russia in the teeth, we just sort of gave a half dose of this, half dose of that, and it came in very slow intervals. So Russia learns to adapt to HIMARS, and then we say, okay, well, now we'll give you cluster weapons, and Russia learns to adapt to cluster weapons, and then they, everything, we slowly titrated everything in. So that strategy may have backfired, but that was the strategy at its core, which is our weapons. By the way, worth noting two things is that those weapons are largely, the Pentagon says, here's the value of the total weapons. It's not true. It was done mostly with what's called Presidential Drawdown Authority. This is literally leftover shit from Iraq and Afghanistan. We were like, hey, do you guys want some of these old MRAPs? Obviously, our soldiers aren't patrolling around the streets of Kandahar getting blown up. Do you guys want them? Ukraine was like, yeah, send them our way. And lo and behold, the MRAPs apparently still absolutely crushing it in modern combat. Literally just today got a text from one of the units in the East saying, dude, check out my new MRAP. This thing is a literal tank. And it is pretty cool. Okay, so let's watch Lindsey Graham continue.
And I'm very proud to have you as our ally.
And I don't know if we can ever do business with Zelensky again. I think most Americans saw a guy that they would not want to go in business with. The way he handled the meeting, the way he confronted the president was just over the top. So I think the relationship between Ukraine and America is important, vitally important. But can Zelensky do a deal with the United States? After what I saw, I don't know.
I want to tell you.
Also sort of funny when he's like, can Zelensky do a deal with the United States after what I just saw? Which is not the same thing as Zelensky is at fault, which is funny. But again, I want to point out that they're just watching politicians just like change their stripes, but also I want to point out be spineless, because it's very clear that Lindsey Graham still wants to see Ukraine, the U.S. back Ukraine, but he just doesn't have the spine to say, Donald Trump, I think you're wrong. I know you were offended because you insulted Zelensky and he didn't just take it, right? I know that's offensive to you. And by the way, Zelensky didn't even address Trump. He addressed the Vice President, J.D. Vance. And again, we saw the same video, guys. We saw the same video. Just rewatch it without your context and see if you think... Yeah, I just can't even listen to some of these things where, again, so many people they'll edit the interview down. They'll tell people what to think about it. They'll tell people what they saw. We all saw the same thing. But the fact is that clearly Lindsey Graham actually does have beliefs, but he is just incapable of telling the president that he's wrong in any meaningful, substantive way. It's insane. It is literally insane to see that you can serve, I'm putting that in big quotes here, serve as a sitting U.S. senator for decades, and you still don't have the power to be like, Mr. President, I think in this one window area you were wrong. Like, really? Damn, dude. Imagine voting for that slime bag again and again and again and again. Now, there's a couple of other stories here I want to talk about. One is that the UK, France, and Ukraine, they're going to try to develop their own ceasefire plan and then present it to the U.S., which is just a testament to how absolutely desperate they have to be for the United States. And we're going to actually, this is part of a larger discussion that I want to have and that apparently Elon Musk wants to have, but we need to explain it because nobody, including the news, seems capable of explaining why things are the way they are. So, and again, the British Prime Minister points out that if there's going to be a deal, it has to hold. That's why we've talked extensively about what are the guarantees, right? There has to be a guarantee because Putin only understands force. That's a key part of a ceasefire deal. And the fact is that the Europeans, though, they don't have the capacity to produce the weapons or scale up the militaries necessary to deter Russia, right? The current Russian military, 500,000 soldiers. The Ukrainian military, probably around 300,000 in total under uniform. And to give you context, no other European country has an active military of over 100,000, right? And this is really one of the biggest problems that they're facing is that the U.S. military has 10 times the personnel. And it would be trivially easy for the U.S. to place its military on a contact line, or even to sit there and say, okay, we are going to offer some kind of munition or air power guarantees. There's all sorts of versions of some kind of guarantee that are not NATO membership that still involve using force to coerce Putin into his deal. But the big question that I think all of us have, and me included, is that how are the Europeans so unable to marshal their own defenses? Because they collectively have an economy roughly the size of the United States, about 2/3 of the US's, maybe 3/4, and they have the personnel. They have a population large enough to field a much larger military, right? And so the question is, why can't they? And the answer, why Elon Musk is, of course, talking about it, but of course, he's doing what Elon Musk always does, which is he has no context, but he just sort of has a hot take, right? He's the final form of the shitty influencer. Elon Musk says, yeah, the U.S., we should withdraw from NATO and the UN, right? This is, of course, on Twitter. Elon Musk agreeing with a MAGA influencer named, no kidding, Gunther Eagleman, who says it's time to leave NATO and the UN. And now, Musk didn't elaborate, but MAGA Turbo Senator Mike Lee has said this, that the U.S. needs to pull out because the U.S. spends a lot on NATO. Hold on, we got to do this in quotes, because the U.S. spends a lot on NATO and doesn't get anything in return. And that is only true if you're an idiot or a Russian, right? And, all right, Lee says, Europe doesn't love us. Let's leave NATO. And this is stupid because, one, they say Norway, NATO ally, publicly announced it would continue to help refuel U.S. military ships, despite one of its private companies saying that they're going to boycott refueling military ships. And therefore, they say, oh, well, Europe doesn't love us. But here is the problem. Here's the number one thing. This is where the New York Post tries to explain that no, NATO, here's what NATO is and does. And they say that it was, of course, point out that NATO, founded in the aftermath of World War II, bulwark against the Soviet Union, 32 members, the core principle of an attack on one constitutes an attack on all, right? And conservative figures have said that NATO allies don't pull enough of their own weight. Elements of the UN have been overly harsh to the U.S. That misses the number one most important thing that NATO does, and that is this right here, the nuclear umbrella. Now, what is the nuclear umbrella? A nuclear umbrella is a guarantee by a nuclear weapon state to defend a non-nuclear allied state. Context is usually in security alliances, such as the United States with Australia, Japan, South Korea, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and in turn, the Compact of Free Association with the Federated States of Micronesia, Marshall Islands, and Palau. There's also, of course, the Collective Security Treaty Organization backed by Russia. And you can see from this map here that there are essentially three kinds of states in the world. There are nuclear states, states protected by a nuclear umbrella, or states who have no or minimal geopolitical influence, right? That is it. If you are a state with any kind of value, you are going to be at risk of what's called nuclear blackmail. And what nuclear blackmail simply is something that occasionally happened when in the early days of nuclear weapons, where a state would simply knock on the door of a neighboring state where they wanted something, and they would say, man, it's a nice capital city you got there. It'd be a shame if somebody were to drop a nuke on it. Why don't you sign this trade deal with us? Why don't you withdraw your forces from this contested region? And to be clear, both the US and Soviet Union were guilty of this in the 40s, and it very quickly became apparent that this was not a game you could play, because sometimes you had the risk of getting called out on it, and then them saying, hey, yeah, do it, drop these nukes. And the thing is that you can see that the nuclear umbrella extends all the way to NATO, right? It extends, the U.S. provides it to Canada, provides it to all NATO members. And you can see that Russia has a comparable relationship with countries like Belarus and all of the Caucasus countries. And I think this is really, really, really important, right? Because the fact is that you might say, oh, well, this is the United States. And these countries, you might notice that these countries that are under the nuclear umbrella, they don't face many geopolitical threats. And you might say, well, this is so silly. Why are we spending all this money? Why are we extending our nuclear arsenal to cover these people? One is that for an ICBM, it doesn't cost you anything. It costs you $0 additional dollars to say, hey, we'll use our ICBMs, which are already targeted towards Russian and Chinese targets. I think they also probably have targets in every nuclear state, but just as a precaution. But you're conflating the problems, right? The Europe of the 1940s was not free of threats. There were threats from a Tito, the Yugoslavian dictator. Hungary had tanks rolling through its streets in the 50s. The Soviets literally dropped the Iron Curtain, splitting Germany in two, right? Europe was continually being divided up until NATO was established and said, listen, the nuclear umbrella extends to our NATO allies, period. You also notice that there's a nice insurance policy baked into NATO, because if somehow the United States was to have all of its nuclear weapons disabled through, let's say, some crazy magic or something, well, the UK and France have nuclear arsenals that provide redundancy. They can cover the NATO alliance and provide deterrent capacity. You know, for example, you may remember that Elon Musk accidentally fired many of the staff, a large portion of the staff who oversee U.S. nuclear weapons. And so while those people were kicked out of the government, it's not clear that the U.S. would have been fully ready to launch a nuclear weapon should Russia or China have tried something. But rest assured, because of the NATO alliance and the nuclear umbrella, France and the UK maintained that level of readiness for us. You don't even realize it. That's what makes me mad, is that someone like Elon doesn't even fucking realize it, that he himself was kept safe only through the use of NATO allies' nuclear umbrellas. And the reason that there's so few threats to these countries, it's not saying, look, there's no threats, there must be NATO must be useless. It's like telling a diabetic, listen, man, why do you take that insulin? You're healthy, you're happy, you can exercise, you're a good weight, your blood work looks good, and you're still taking that insulin. That's stupid. That insulin is a waste of money. That's exactly what you're doing right now. If the U.S. was to withdraw its nuclear umbrella, chances are what would really happen is that NATO would say, we're still NATO, when it would demand that France and Britain expand their nuclear arsenals really, really, really rapidly. That's probably what would have to happen. But in that interval, the problem would be that Russia would say, hey, today, while the U.S. is withdrawn from NATO, we can start to annex all the countries we've ever wanted because they can't stop us. We don't even have to march our military through them. We just simply knock on their door and say, listen, Moldova, I notice that you're arguing that our Russian-backed separatist region of Transnistria, you're going to recognize Transnistria's independence as an independent country today, or else we're going to fucking flatten your capital city. Moldova's going to go, well, shit, what choice do we have? Well, actually, that's not a good example because you can see Moldova's not protected. But pick your contested region. I mean, generally, again, I'm proving my own point here. You notice that there aren't any of those countries. You notice all the countries where Russia's like annexed, carved off a little piece for themselves, right? Transnistria, South Ossetia. All those countries are in gray here, right? And all of the countries that are in blue, they don't have Russian-backed separatists carving them out, slicing them up like a fucking ham. And it's because of the nuclear shield, right? But once that disappears, or Putin believes it disappears or gets reduced heavily, then you're going to be in a situation where he's going to start playing those same games. You're going to see a mysterious, what's the word I want? You're going to see a separatist group start to annex parts of Finland, parts of Slovakia, parts of Estonia, Lithuania. You're going to see these things start to emerge. And it is a an inevitable consequence, right? You notice too, right? Look at these areas that don't have this nuclear umbrella. They are subject to constant little petty coercions, right? You can see that Venezuela, Guyana, remember those guys have some stupid territorial dispute. Look at every country in Africa. They are subject to constant incursions and territorial wars because they don't have a stable security. Now, it's a little bit of like a self-fulfilling circle, right? Like stable countries are brought into the nuclear umbrella because they're stable and well-governed. They're welcomed in, and that means they're safer, so their governance gets even better, so that they become more stable, their security environment improves, so that they like it's a virtuous cycle. And the fact is that you have someone like Elon Musk who doesn't understand this, and I want to point out two other really important points. One is that NATO does a lot of stuff. You can see since 2001, remember, NATO was essential to resolving the Serbia and Kosovo genocide, ethnic cleansing or whatever truism Clinton used for it. But also, even since 2000, you can see that whether they have disarmed the insurgent groups in North Macedonia, NATO actually asked for assistance. The U.S. asked NATO countries for assistance in patrolling their airspace to ensure another 9/11 didn't occur. This went on for almost a year because the U.S. was caught so flat-footed. It needed NATO assistance after 9/11. You also, of course, saw NATO engaging in maritime patrols to deter and detect terrorism, but likely also a part of that active endeavor was about preventing securing the borders of NATO, which is weird because that's something that Elon Musk repeatedly has said is a grave problem facing Europe or whatever, and yet NATO is the vehicle that does some of their most robust counter border security missions. And of course, you can't forget the 15-year-long International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. This was the primary fighting force in Afghanistan, and this is why, of course, many of these NATO countries say, damn, dudes, so many of our soldiers were killed in Afghanistan. Germans, Poles, British, Czechs, Canadian soldiers, all of which were killed in Afghanistan defending with NATO patches on their uniform, right? NATO deterred Iraqi aggression into Turkey, Pakistani earthquake relief. I mean, you can see it, right? Enforcing the no-fly zone in Libya, resolute support, the training and advisory mission in Afghanistan, the counter ISIS mission in Iraq. And of course, even now, they are out there engaging in a deterrent mission against the Russian forces who are cutting submarine cables, trying to isolate the Baltic countries. So literally, to sit there and say NATO doesn't do anything is absolutely stupid. In fact, the U.S. makes money on NATO, and this is the most important takeaway for this entire video. If you understand nothing else, understand this, is that the U.S. sold $100 billion in arms to NATO allies and partners through the State Department. $100 billion. For the record, for those of you keeping track at home, guys, that is as much money as has been deployed to Ukraine in security assistance. That is how valuable this is. And by the way, that's this year. That's 2024, right? The total foreign military sales was $117 billion. So around, I'm going to say 90%, around 90%, it looks like about 87% of military sales U.S. companies make are sold to NATO allies. So when NATO asks us, hey man, I know you have some extra gear lying around. Can you help us secure a critical security situation in Europe? The U.S. says, for our best customers, for our $100 billion a year customers, guys, I will do that and I will send you your kids presents on Christmas. This is nothing. We have all this, we're America. We have all this shit lying around, right? Those HIMARS systems we sent to Ukraine, they were 30 years old. They were going to the scrap heap, right? All those MRAPs, they were just sitting around from Afghanistan. The Ukrainians were like, you want to repaint these? They said, yeah, we'll repaint them. We'll take them. You guys doing anything? We got all these mortars that we were slinging at the Taliban. We obviously aren't doing that anymore. Taliban won. Ukrainians were like, yeah, send them our way. So this whole thing, and a lot of the aid, and remember, some of the aid is not aid, it's a loan. And some of the aid was not aid, it was sold. So this is just an absolute, it's just an absolute win. The United States has profited so much more off of NATO. We've gotten so much more out of it. Because remember, here's the other thing that is really important to remember. Let's say that a NATO country who has bought billions of dollars in U.S. weapons, they wake up and they say, you know what, F the U.S., F the U.S. We're done with you, America. We are gonna do something that you hate. We're gonna sign a military alliance with China, right? Or we're gonna tariff you and we're gonna trade exclusively with China. Well, America's gonna go, that's great. But now we are not gonna sell you parts. We're not gonna sell you weapons. We're not gonna sell you anything. And your military is exclusively equipped with U.S. weapons because NATO requires what they call interoperability, which means that a French mechanic has to be able to fix an American fighter jet. It means that German ammunition needs to be able to be loaded into Slovakian guns. All this interoperability means that the U.S. says, listen, you guys, instead of having to all make your own things, why don't you all just buy from the Walmart of weapons? Us. And that means that if you want to maintain your stuff, or you want to make sure your guns still have ammunition, or you want to make sure that you can still operate, right? That your militaries are ready to fight with the most modern stuff, you guys just buy it from us. So again, this is the thing that I really, people don't understand. It is a spectacularly good deal for the United States. Because again, we say, oh, we spend all this money. We spend all this money to protect ourselves. And it costs us nothing to help our friends, right? It costs nothing. And in fact, we make all of this money back. Remember, the entire U.S. defense budget, the whole thing, is $800 billion a year. And we sell $100 billion of weapons to our NATO allies. Do you see how the profitability here, right? Even if the U.S., let's say those sales end up taxed, result in only 10% of tax revenue. It's more because of import duties and foreign military sales and licenses and all this other stuff. And it's really complex because there's also an economy of scale, right? It's cheaper to make artillery, it's cheaper to make replacement tank axles for 500 different customers than it is to make 50. But if the U.S. only got 10% of the value of that, it still would represent a subsidy of basically all of the aid to Ukraine that's sent out every year. And then some. And then there'd be some left over. So the fact is that nobody's out here telling you these things. Nobody. Not even the left-wing media, who's supposed to be the defenders of this system. Nobody bothers to explain how this works. Only I feel like I'm out here alone doing it. And I appreciate you guys that hit that subscribe button. And my goal with telling you these things is that you guys have this ability, when you hear your friends say something stupid, like we don't get anything out of NATO, you can explain to them that we get a backup nuclear arsenal that will protect us if something fucked up happens. And we sell $100 billion a year in weapons to NATO. And we see all of that cash here in the US of A. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to Bill Collier, Robert Colburn, Martin, Eugenia Cuesta, Chris Gorsuch, Francis Carias, AL90, Pecha Taruru, all of our Lieutenant Tier members. Couldn't do it without you guys. See you in the next one. Cheers.